Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Why is My Baby Not Sleeping? I'm sure, having looked at part 1 and part 2, your mind is blown. You never realized that so much went into sleeping well. I'm hoping to add a little bit more information for you today. So part 3 is all about food hunger. Okay, so if we look back, you'll remember that in part 1, we covered sleep hunger, in part 2, social hunger, and now in part 3, we're looking at food hunger. What I hope that you'll learn in this video is a good understanding between feeding and sleep. You will be able to recognize what is responsive feeding, which is also known as demand feeding. You'll be able to recognize cluster feeding and how it relates to growth spurts. And you'll also have learned how to apply what you've learned here to your family to make sleep happen more easily. Okay, so what is really important is that we cannot truly separate food hunger and social hunger. Every time you feed your baby, you're giving them a little bit of social interaction or even a lot of social interaction. So if you think about coming to the breast or coming to the bottle, there is you. You really can't separate the two. You're not feeding through a tube. You're not feeding, through a machine. And so your baby is getting some human interaction with each feed. And for that reason, I did social hunger first, because I want your baby to have a good relationship with you and to trust you so that the feeding experiences are positive. Okay, so let's look a little bit at kind of the link between feeding and sleep. So food hunger is our most obvious hunger. It's not something I really need to explain to you. Your baby needs to eat to thrive and survive. Your baby needs to eat more if they're growing or if they're healing from an illness. And your baby, if they are healthy, they are programmed with the desire to tell you that they're hungry, the desire to look for food, and they should be actively coming towards your breast or actively coming towards the bottle. In the first year, your baby's primary source of food is going to be milk, whether that's breast milk or formula, and you're going to slowly introduce solids. Some babies will start as early as 4.5 months. The general guideline is 6 months, but you can always read more about that in my book in terms of solid readiness to eat solids. Okay. Now, what is tricky for us as humans is that our babies are exceptionally vulnerable and they need their needs met 24/7. Healthy babies will wake both during the day and at night. And remember, in that first 4-month or 4th trimester, they are not going to know the difference between day and night. And so they're going to be waking up fairly intermittently. There's not going to be as much of a routine that you can see, but as you expose them to light, as they grow and get a bit stronger, you should notice that more of the feeds are happening in the day and fewer at night, until eventually it feels like, the day is more where you are doing most of your feeds. Now, it's also important to tell you that some parents feel like their baby is sleeping so well because they are really, really drowsy both during the day and often not waking at all at night to feed. And I just want to warn you about this. We want babies to practice waking up. When they practice waking up, they're not just getting food in, but they're also practicing breathing. And that suck, swallow, breathe, I'm going to look at it more later on, but it's a really, really important skill and something that they do need to practice. If your baby is really sleepy, just hold in mind that maybe their blood sugar is low and they're actually feeling quite weak. And the reason they're sleeping so much is actually to conserve energy. So we do want babies waking and feeding regularly. And also to remember is it is normal for your baby to have discomfort after eating. The reason for this is that their digestive system is really immature. So in an ideal world, your baby will be born, they will get colostrum, and then they will get breast milk, which is more easily digestible. That process doesn't always happen for every family. And so it's important for you to understand that if your baby does get given formula, you can expect that they might have more gut discomfort. Their gut maturing is part of the process, but I would say that if you can see that there is extreme pain after feeds, blood in the stools, frothy stools, or anything like that, please consult your pediatrician. Okay. It's also really important to note that humans are mammals, and that means that we suck to feed and we also suck to sleep. So the idea of trying to separate feeding from sleep is just ridiculous. It's not going to work. We are mammals. Okay, so like I was mentioning to you, we need to consider the dark womb. So the dark womb, there was a lovely thick placenta and an umbilical cord, and through this cord, your baby was getting all their nutrition 24/7. So that meant they never had a sugar low, they never had a sugar high, they were never short on anything that they needed. They were just able to move around, sleep, wake, suck, and get what they needed. But as soon as they are born, as soon as that umbilical cord is cut and that placenta is removed, your baby suddenly has the job of waking and feeding actively. And the meconium that you see, those black poos after they're born, that is the unused gut cells that have died and kind of just been sitting in there for their full pregnancy. That is those cells coming out. So if you think about getting a cut and how it forms a scab and then the scab peels off and it's dark in color, it's the same. It's like your baby's gut has been developing, cells have been kind of building up, and actually your baby hasn't needed to use their gut at all. And so that is why those cells are coming out. So it's a fresh, clean slate, this new gut. And we want to populate that gut with all sorts of good bacteria, which your baby is going to get from your skin, your world. And we know that babies actually do better in terms of having less allergies if they're exposed to more pets, more people. So we don't want to keep them in a completely sterile environment, but we want to respect the fact that we need to protect their immature gut. Okay, so these are the common sleep thieves. I discuss them more in my book, but I just want you to be aware that all of these things connect to feeding. And so if you suspect any of these, I would say go and see your pediatrician, your family GP, or your nursing sister and have a look with them in more detail. I also would recommend that you take with a sample of your baby's poo so that they can see it if there's something that you're worried about. And also if your baby is vomiting, you can also take a photo of it afterwards so that you can show the size of the vomit to your health professional. Okay, so as we look at the different ways of feeding your baby, I want you to just remember this from the previous presentations. Okay, you cannot force your baby to eat, sleep, or poop. You can't do it. It's not possible. So you might have an idea of how you would like your baby to feed. You may have plans. That's great, but your baby might not go along with them. It's a team effort. And remember, feeding is fitting into these goals of the first year, which is to establish trust, to create a secure bond with secure attachment, and to experience joy together. So feeding should feel safe. It should feel mostly positive, and you should enjoy feeding your baby most of the time. Okay, so these are the three approaches to feeding that we're going to look at now: scheduled feeding, responsive feeding, and cluster feeding. Scheduled feeding is where an adult has the full responsibility of the feed, and the adult gives the feed to the child with or without the child's consent. It's at set intervals, the child's a passive recipient, the adult is in control. So with scheduled feeding, what is tricky is that coercion can become a big feature of feeding. So what that means is that you position the baby in a certain way, or you offer the feed in a certain way that you really are not listening to the baby's cues. So that even if the baby's telling you, no, I don't want to feed right now, you're saying, no, I know better, you're going to feed. And with coercion, it can be as simple as feeding the baby faster than the baby would like, or slower than the baby would like, or too much food. So I think as adults, we often do think that more is more. And we often have this idea that if we can get a bigger volume in, we'll have a longer interval between this feed and the next feed. And I often see this where parents will overfeed in the last feed before bedtime, hoping that that will kind of give them a longer amount of sleep. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Okay, so why do we like this as health professionals? Why do we like this method as parents? I think it's because we can collect data, right? So we can say, I've given 3 feeds today, they were 150 mils. Or we can say, my baby is drinking this much in a day, which makes us feel like we can measure our effort. It makes us feel like we're succeeding. The problem with this is that food gets seen as a medicine. Food gets seen as a dose. It is taken away from the family meal. It's taken away from being something that is, full of enjoyment. And instead, it just becomes very, very ugh. And it's hard, I think, for parents if you've started in this position where perhaps you've had a premature infant that was in the NICU, where this was how they had to feed your baby because your baby was too little to give hunger cues, too little to participate actively. And now you are needing to kind of move as they get bigger from that scheduled feeding to more of a demand feeding picture. And that is something that you can just walk through respectfully with your child. And you can always obviously discuss it with your health provider. But ultimately, we want to be more concerned about it being a positive feeding experience than the fact that you managed to get your 150 ml feed in, on to the hour every 4 hours throughout the day. Now, scheduled feeding is also necessary in certain situations where we're tracking a child's weight for growth. So a child that is underweight, that hasn't been thriving, often then we do need to kind of prescribe feeds, but this should be done with a dietitian who has a very respectful way of working with your child. Okay, let's look at responsive feeding. I'm going to get it like this now. Okay, so responsive feeding is what UNICEF would say is a superior way of feeding your child. It's seen as the child communicating hunger, the adult responding by feeding the child in a loving way. It's more of a partnership. So if you think about a family mealtime as a feed compared to a separate feeding event. So instead of getting up and going to feed your baby away from everybody else, we see it as your baby being part of the mealtime, and maybe your baby's meals are milk feeds, but they are being exposed to you feeding. They're being exposed to various foods, the sights, the smells of them, as opposed to being kept separate from those family meal times. It relies on the parent trusting the child's interoception, which is your internal sense of hunger and fullness. It's your internal sense of when you need the toilet or when you're going to vomit. And so it's really trusting that your baby is a clever organism. Your baby is a little person who has feelings and ideas and preferences, which can be quite tricky when you have a very young baby. And the problem with it is that it often gives us very limited data because we don't always know exact volumes or exact times. And so instead of worrying about that, what we do is you tell parents in the short term, you're going to look for wet nappies. And in the long term, you're going to look for your baby outgrowing their clothes. Okay, so I love this slide. I'm going to let it take up the whole screen. So Ellen Satter is a therapist that works within feeding therapy, and she came up with the division of responsibility. And this is just kind of the groundwork that we use when we have a child with feeding difficulties because of coercion, because of oral aversion. This is kind of how we bring them back. But even if your baby isn't there, you haven't kind of hit that bump in the road, you can use this method to help you avoid that conflict. So she says, you are to take leadership with the what, when, and where of feeding, and you're going to let your child determine how much and whether to eat of what you provide. Okay, so if you think about this, you are deciding, I'm going to try breastfeed my child. I'm going to offer them the left breast or the right breast. Your baby is going to decide within that meal, I'm going to drink from this breast for this long, or I'm going to change over and be unsatisfied and go with the other one. Or you might decide breastfeeding is not comfortable for me. This is not something that I'm happy about. And so it's not working. We're going to change over to formula. And then you're going to decide what formula. You're going to decide, am I going to offer this bottle now as soon as you wake up? Am I going to offer the bottle before you go to sleep? But you're going to use the baby's cues to guide you on whether that feed is going to continue or whether you're going to try again later. And as it gets to solids, it would be the same thing. You are going to shop for the food or grow the food. You're going to cook the food. You're going to present the food either as, baby-led weaning as a solid or as a puree, and your baby's going to decide what they want to eat and which kind of version they like and enjoy. Okay, so one of the most unsettling things is when you have been doing either scheduled feeding or responsive feeding, and you've kind of found a pattern if you've been doing responsive feeding, and you think you kind of know now when your baby needs feeds, and then they go and have a growth spurt. Now, suddenly, instead of feeding, maybe it's every 2 hours or every 3 hours or every hour and a half, suddenly it feels like they're on your breast or on the bottle the whole day. What this does, if you're breastfeeding, is it actually increases your milk supply in anticipation for the fact that your baby's going to need more milk because they're getting bigger. So the cluster feeding matches the growth spurts, but it is exhausting and can be very frustrating. It happens mostly in the first 2 months of life, which is why I think moms are often the most tired in those first 8 weeks. But it does happen again between 4 and 6 months when your baby transitions to solids. It's like they're kind of like building up and needing all of that milk because they're not yet able to digest those and absorb those solids that they're getting in. And then during teething, we often see cluster feeding. There's a few theories about why. Is it for pain? Because we know that sucking relieves pain. Is it to increase the amount of antibodies that they're getting from you? Because we know that teething and mouthing on things brings germs into your mouth, so you're more likely to get viral infections. We're not sure, but you will often note that after a cluster feeding episode, there'll be a tooth that pops out. Okay, so for me as a therapist, my long-term feeding goals for you and your baby would be these. Okay, I would want your baby to sit upright and feed themselves. I wouldn't want your baby to get stuck being positioned on their back or in a semi-reclining chair and eating like a hamster. Okay, that's not what we're going for. I would want your baby to be able to hold their own spoon, their cup, their bottle, right? Because why are they holding it? Because they are motivated, they are loving what they're doing. I'd love them to start eating when they're hungry and stop eating when they are full, that they learn to trust that process, that they're not under or overeating. I would love for them not to have regular negative feeding events. Negative feeding events could be vomiting, gagging, coughing or spitting up, or really just kind of having to be in an environment where the feeding is pressure. They feel pressure, and so just the whole meal is unenjoyable. And you will know this if you go to maybe like a business lunch, or maybe you go to a family member who you don't enjoy his house for lunch. Getting through that meal, you're not going to eat as much. Whereas if you are laughing, if you are playing, if you're enjoying it, you will often eat more calories than you would have if you were eating by yourself at home. Okay, so we want your baby to become an active participant in family meals, and preferably for you all to be together at a table. Okay, so how we can use this mammalian response of sucking for both feeding, which is nutritive, and non-nutritive, which helps with calming and sleeping. Okay, so babies love to suck to fall asleep. Sucking falls under proprioception, which is deep pressure. It's in your oral cavity. It's very close to your brain. It's a very intense way of feeding that need. And so your feeding should make your baby become drowsy. That is a normal response to both sucking and getting milk in. It's also important to note that if you're breastfeeding, day milk has different properties to night milk. The milk that you make at night actually contains chemicals that make your baby drowsy. So trying to not let your baby fall asleep on the breast or not let your baby fall asleep on the bottle is just ludicrous, okay? So please do not feel pressure to separate feeding and sleep events. If your baby falls asleep while they are sucking, good for you. Sucking is like the superpower that helps us put our babies to sleep, so please use it. Okay, non-nutritive sucking. I often get lots of questions about this. So non-nutritive sucking is your baby sucking for pleasure. Now your baby was already sucking their hands in utero, and often you will find that they are sucking on their thumb or your finger, a dummy, a toy, a blanket after they're out. Babies love suckling, and you don't need to try and keep this from them. You do need to sterilize dummies regularly if you're using them, but only to the point that your baby is mobile. Once they're mobile and their hands are on the floor, I feel like we've lost the battle, and then you can just wash dummies with soap and water. It's wonderful to, if your baby does take a dummy, to be able to give them their dummy when they need it, which would be when their dial is all the way up in terms of their nervous system. They're crying, they're hurt, they're very tired. You pop the dummy in, and it's just this kind of instant relief, which is wonderful. You're not teaching your baby a bad habit. Sucking is just something that is programmed in them. They are a mammal, their brain is immature, and they need this to be able to calm down. Equally, if you want to pop them onto your breast to calm them down, you can. You know, that is your superpower. That is what your breasts are there for. I would just like to say that you should avoid dummy chains at night because they can be hazardous. And then from 9 months old, I would encourage you, instead of like taking your baby's dummy out and kind of hiding it away, to put your baby's dummy in a sleep spot. So you start to speak to your baby who's starting to get more and more receptive language. Yes, I know it's crazy, but by the end of the first year, they have a lot of receptive language if you've been speaking to them, which I'm sure you have. And so show your baby, when you can't find your dummy, here it is. It's, you know, on the corner of your bed, or it's under this pillow, or it's here next to you in your right hand, so that if your baby is waking at night, they would be able to put their dummy back in if they needed it to go to sleep. I've popped these here. Maybe you can take a screen grab of this. This is the UNICEF feeding guidelines for the whole world. They have been written with the World Health Organization. And I just want to show you that everything that I'm telling you today, it's not my opinion. It is based on neuroscience. It's based on best practice. It's based on what we know creates the best long-term outcome for the whole population. So I'm not going to go through every one of these, but please take a screen grab and stick this on your fridge. And when you're feeling like, oof, am I doing enough? Am I doing okay? Go back to this and you will see that you are doing what you need to do. Okay, so I do feel like we need to be very specific and just bust these 3 myths quickly. So what some parents try to do is they do their sort of last feed of the day, they put their baby down for night, and then just before they go to sleep, they kind of pop a bottle in their baby's mouth or pop a boob in their baby's mouth. And they might find that their baby drinks really well when they're drowsy or when they're half asleep. Now, I hate this. And the reason is there's no evidence to show that this top-up feed before you go to sleep prolongs sleep. Because remember, we're waking for many reasons, not just to drink. So one of the things that this can create is this kind of idea in parents' minds of making the baby more of a passive recipient. So I'm going to feed you when you're half asleep and you're too tired to protest. Or I'm going to feed you on the breast because you're avoiding the breast during the day. Now, if your baby's avoiding feeds during the day, either on the breast or on the bottle, there's something happening that is making your baby feel uncomfortable. It might be that they're not posturally aligned to the breast or to the bottle. It might be that you're feeding them too quickly or maybe too slowly and they're losing interest. Or it could be that they are having pain or discomfort. And I would really like you to get help rather than feeding your baby when they're asleep and then we land up with a full-blown feeding aversion. Okay. Your baby will sleep better if you give them porridge at dinner time. Okay, so this myth number 2, is really prevalent where I'm from, which is South Africa, Africa. So a lot of our kind of people, we will put porridge into a bottle. That's your last bottle of the day. And we'll sometimes do that to babies as young as 1 month old. And this is so bad for that vulnerable, immature gut. Porridge cannot be digested. It's just going to go through. But it's this idea that it's heavier and it's going to somehow make them feel more full and sleep better. Please don't do that. Please, once again, don't trick your baby. Don't add things to your baby's milk that they don't know is in there. Let's rather do responsive feeding and have a healthier relationship going forward with food. Okay, and then the third one is that if you don't feed your baby at night, they'll stop waking up. So, not good at all. for so many reasons. But your baby does need to feed at night. Even if you're feeding them a lot during the day, your baby needs to get hydration, warmth, and nourishment at night. They are still really, really, really little. It is normal for babies to need extra feeds or night feeds up until the age of 3, depending on their metabolism. So you might have a baby with a very slow metabolism and your baby doesn't wake at night to feed anymore. Great for you. You might find that as they go through a growth spurt, they start waking up at night. And we really want to give them the opportunity to feed, because you will know what it's like to wake up hungry. You're going to go and have some yogurt, or you're going to go and have, a glass of milk to get back to sleep. So please do not do these things to your baby, and you're going to create more problems than solutions. Okay, so I wanted to read you a story. Usually I read you stories about my patients, but today I'm going to read you a story that I wrote about my own experience when I was breastfeeding my first child. So my first baby was 1 month old, and I was told to stop feeding her so often. She was feeding every 2 hours for half an hour. I was exhausted. The clinic sister advised that I probably did not have enough milk. I assured her that my breasts were full. In fact, they were overflowing. She then said, perhaps your milk is not rich enough for your baby. You should top up after each feed with formula and aim to feed 15 minutes later each day. I went to the shop and I bought stage 1 formula. After her next breastfeed ended, I pleaded and pressed and shoved the bottle of formula into the mouth of my drowsy, full-bellied baby. She would not drink more. I could not top her up. After digesting the breast milk, she woke and wanted to feed an hour and a half later. Armed with a bottle of formula, I decided to feed with that first. It was surely richer than my low-grade breast milk, and then I would breastfeed her later. She downed the bottle, but then refused to breastfeed. My poor breasts were raring to go, so while she slept, I had to pump, which is never as fun as it sounds. Despite the full formula feed of rich milk, she woke up an hour and a half later and wanted to feed again. Following the clinic sister's advice, I tried to push her to a longer interval between feeds. I said, no, you must wait another 15 minutes like the nurse said. She didn't seem to understand. She wailed for 15 minutes. After all that, she could not settle on the breast. She tossed through her breastfeed, drinking between deep, sad little sobs. I had made so much work for myself, sterilizing a bottle, pumping both sides, and then trying to feed a flailing and wailing baby. I learned that day that my baby wanted to feed every 2 hours, whether it was formula or breast milk. So I gave up the regime and went back to breastfeeding. It required the least amount of effort for me, and I was exhausted. At my next clinic visit, I was terrified. I would have to inform the clinic sister that I had not succeeded at topping up or stretching feeds. I had failed. Thankfully, I was assigned a different nurse. She looked at me and asked, "How often are you feeding?" I sucked the air in deep and whispered, like every 2 hours. She didn't even look up. She said, "Good. Breastfed babies need to feed 8 to 12 times a day." That day, I learned that babies feed more often and less predictably than the books tell you. I had felt like a failure doing 8 to 12 feeds a day when I thought I was supposed to be doing 6 feeds a day. Meanwhile, what I had been doing was healthy and helpful. I also learned that by trying to fix my baby's feeding schedule and increase the intervals between the feeds, I had unintentionally made it worse for us both. As the days went on, I actually felt less tired, even though I was still feeding so often. By not keeping track and not striving to meet a certain magic number, I was using less mental energy. Do what works for you and your baby, and let go of chasing the perfect number. Okay, so I want to encourage you, if you're not chasing that perfect number, if you're not timing things, if you're not tracking which boob, what's happening, what are you supposed to be looking out for? And I would say it's these signs. So you want to see that your baby likes feeding. If your baby is enjoying feeding, that is brilliant. You're doing a great job. I would also love for you to be enjoying feeding your baby most of the time, because like I said, feeding is social. And if you're eating with someone that doesn't want to be there, it's really not great. Your baby is growing a little bit bigger each week and eating a wider variety of foods as the months go by. So when you start to introduce solids, you start to see that they are interested in more and more foods as the months go by. Your baby's an active participant in feeds, and you're practicing responsive feeding and avoiding force feeding, no matter how tempting it seems. Now, I want to just note the pictures that I've included in this slide. So as you move from milk feeds towards solid feeds, my ideal setup for our culture, for feeds, for family meals, would be a baby in a high chair with foot support, like you can see in this one. And I would want the baby to be well stacked. So head on top of shoulders, on top of hips, which means that when they chew, the food is going down. There's nice space. They're not crunched over, and they're not getting too much support. In this chair, your baby would be able to move around a little bit. I also don't like trapping children at the table. So I wouldn't necessarily have like a thick harness or belts. Obviously, you want to keep your baby safe, but also how a lot of children say I'm done with this meal is they get up and leave. Okay. And as your baby gets older, they will get better and better at staying with you in the meal for longer as their attention stretches. But what is nice about a high chair is that you can bring it to the family table, and then your baby is seeing your feeding strategies. Your baby is smelling your food, seeing your food, and they might even reach out and grab, some corn off your plate, or reach and want to suck on a chicken bone. These are all really wonderful behaviors because they are getting a chance to interact with these foods before it is essential that they are taking in a big volume of them. Now, another way to do this, which is also brilliant, we don't see it as much here in Cape Town where I practice, but is floor sitting. So if you are a family from a culture that eats around a table on the floor, or in a style that I call picnicking, which is maybe on a blanket in your garden or at the beach, then absolutely pop your baby maybe onto your leg so that their bottom is on your thigh and their feet is touching the floor. So you've basically created a high chair, and then go about your family meal that way. If you are part of a culture that eats with their hands and not with tools, well, your baby is in luck, because that is how babies prefer to eat, is with their hands rather than with utensils. So absolutely, you can introduce utensils to your baby, but ideally we would want your baby developing that eye, hand, mouth coordination before they're starting to work with a utensil. And that's also because we want your baby to be desensitized to food. We want them to take in the information through their hand first. Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it slimy? Is it rough? Before the food is in their mouth. Whereas if you are feeding them with a spoon, it's often this like giant surprise when the food lands in their mouth. So see if you can implement some of these strategies, and I'm sure you're going to have some pretty happy food memories. So we are 3/4 of our way through the Why Is My Baby Not Sleeping series. There's one more to come, which is sensory hunger, where we're going to look at how you can use sensory stimulation, sensory input to help your baby to sleep better. Please let me know if you have any questions relating to food and sleep. It is such a huge topic. It's really difficult to cover everything in detail, but I'm just wanting to give you enough that you can then take these ideas and apply them to your home. And remember, if you would like to look into this information in more detail, you're welcome to grab a copy of the Unicorn Baby book. And at the back of the Unicorn Baby book, I have all my references. So if you want to go even further and read the journal articles for yourself, that's how you can access them. Great.